a colleague, someone who is out there, what do you feel taking silence for many years? There was a song, I don't know if you heard it, we used to listen to it by Simon and Garfunkel, Sounds of Silence. It is a very mystical kind of a song, and I figured out what exactly it meant, but it sounded very profound. Over the years, I've begun to value silence. I used to try being silent. It's difficult. When I was younger, but I then realized that apart from anything else, there is great peace within us, which we are often not in touch with. And if we make some effort to be silent, I mean, I would say this way 10, 20 years, but then maybe we just have to do it in a fun way. We are meditating or we are doing something else or concentrating on something. With the older group, like you, we are adults. So, what I say is that give it a try. It's not easy to decide. You may think it's silly, but you know it's not silly. You just don't do it, you know it's not. So, try and see what you experience. Just, why don't you speak about how the father is with us today, and I just check up on the teachers.
I am sort of involved with Himalayan tradition, to which Sir also belongs. Sir is one of the senior most teachers, worldwide teachers in the tradition. I was looking out for people who are practicing therapies, counseling, and are doing it in an Indian kind of manner. So I stumbled upon Sir's website through certain links from friends, and then I read up his CV, and I asked Suneet sir to invite him for a lecture, and then we found out that he was traveling to India to Rishikesh for a couple of months, and then we asked him if he could come here, and he didn't have really time, but he squeezed in a couple of days for us, and that's how he is here. He's a licensed psychotherapist in US. He has a private practice. He is acting professor at a couple of universities in US, has been practicing for the past 30 or 40 years maybe. He got initiated into the Himalayan tradition by Swami Veda, who is a direct disciple of Swami Rama. We have all studied and have learned about Swami Rama. And I was speaking with her, and I realized there's so much we can learn from him directly as part of our curriculum, as part of life as such. And I don't think I have no words to be able to describe what Sir can offer to us. He would be able to help us understand a lot more than what a lecture can squeeze in.
So, we just told you the background how we arrived at this moment. My take is begun to be very different now. These things are all somewhere already planned, and we just doing our bit and it happens. We are not making it happen. Some other force behind it. Of course, we are connected to that force. It is part of us, but it's not these cannot be understood at this level alone. And so Divya mentioned to me that Dr. Parker is doing this work on yoga and psychotherapy for many years. Also a disciple of, she mentioned Swami Ram, that lineage, and Swami Ram in particular. And I wrote to him and people are aware that he would be visiting in March. And he said that I try in March, otherwise I'm coming back in November. But he didn't manage. He's leaving tonight, going back to the US. And I put up the background. I don't know, you may not have read it, but do read it afterwards. His credentials are impressive. Very, very impressive in many ways and in many areas. And so I think we are blessed and honored to have him with us. He has an additional advantage over what I offer. So I can do it and I do it now and then. But he's kept abreast with the cutting edge research in different areas of science, especially neuroscience. And how now in the last decade, so many findings are supporting the consciousness perspective, the yogic perspective, the idea of even the potential for extraordinary capacities. These we are getting evidences more and more. And he said something which is actually very dramatic. The evidence is more and more evidence is accumulating now that number one, this whole idea that consciousness is a key phenomenon. Brain is this complex thing which is organized into so many billions of interconnections, and presto you have consciousness. That view has been discarded. And what is emerging is that it is the mind, the consciousness. The mind programs the brain, not the other way. So while in the car, I was bringing Dr. Parker here, sharing these things, and I said, it'd be nice because the format is an introductory lecture, and then more in the workshop mode. And of course, questions and all those, there'll be plenty of space for them. So I said it would be good if you emphasize that, because my colleagues and many of the students are skeptical about this talk about Indian psychology, consciousness, extraordinary capacities, etc. So I said it would be good if you sort of do focus on that, because I haven't kept abreast. Now I'm inspired to read more. I have been reading, but not after the late 90s as such. And see, last semester in the paper on counseling, I took up, basically we started to do one, in every paper I expose the students to the various approaches briefly and take up one in depth. So, for example, in the semester Buddhism, Buddhist psychology is being taken with them. And we have invited people also who comes, who is a practitioner and a scholar of Buddhism, though I'm a mechanical engineer by profession. And so in the last semester with the third semester students, we took up yoga and psychotherapy. And that was the title of the book, I think, Yoga and Psychotherapy by Swami Ram, Swami Ajay, and Rudolph. And we did that. The students were meant to read a chapter every week, and then we would just discuss and went very well. So this is actually a continuity that they were coming from that lineage, and with those words I will hand over the mic to you and share this.
Pardon me. forgive me for offending the formality of Indian educational etiquette, but I'm a very informal person, and so I decided it would be better to sit closer so that we can have more of an interaction. In general, this afternoon, I'll say a few things for certain, but I'm most interested in what comments and questions you have, and I think that this will better meet your needs if it's more of a conversation. So I think that's how things develop over the course of the afternoon. Let's just begin by being a little silent for a moment. Just sit comfortably in your chair with your head, neck, and trunk aligned, feet on the ground. And just feel the space your body occupies. Let your eyes gently close. And feel your body from head to toe. Bring your mind back from all other spaces. And just feel the cave of space inside your skin. And as you do that, bring your mind back from all the time, back from the past and memory, back from the future and anticipation. And feel the flow and the touch of the breath in your nostrils. Allow your breath to flow free and deep. You may even feel as if your whole body breathes. Feel the breath as if it were washing you from the crown of your head to your toes with your exhaling breath. Energizing you from toes to the crown of your head with your inhale. Feel that gentle wave of breath and Varma. Current of life. Let that gentle flow help you relax any tightness in your muscles. Feel inside any points of tightness, gently and lovingly, until the muscles just let go. Feel inside your forehead, relax your forehead. Let go inside your eyes and eyebrows. Your cheeks and the corners of your mouth, your jaw. Feel inside your neck, your shoulders. Down inside your upper arms, forearms. Feel the breath as if it were flowing upper arms, and your shoulders. Let go of your shoulders. Feel down inside your chest. Relax your upper back and ribs. Feel down into the heart center in the center of your chest. Let your breath flow from this place. Breathe deep. Relax your heart center. Feel down around your navel. And down into your hip joints. Your gluteal muscles. Your thighs. Lower legs. Your feet. And your toes. Feel all your toes. And feel your whole body breathing. Now feel the breath flowing between your navel and your nostrils. Just watch. And as you observe, notice how your breath begins to change. Becomes a bit longer, smoother, deeper. And just allow these natural changes to continue. As you sit by this quiet, flowing stream, just listen for your mantra, if you have a personal mantra, or your favorite divine name, or just the sound of your breath. The exhaling breath. Slowly inhaling breath. Breath, mind, and sound flowing together in a single stream. Flowing your mind more and more still. prayer of gratitude to the ancient lineage, Guru Parampara, the perennial river of life, flowing within us and between us and each moment. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. I have a friend, Varma, truly gifted yoga teacher, with whom I travel to most of the places we visit in the world, doing teacher training seminars, and silent retreats, and in fact, I think I spend more time at Ashitosh than I do at my house. He lives in Germany, married a German lady. He's from Rishikesh. And he always introduces me to people as a white Indian, and I always introduce him to people as a brown German, because in his mind he is very German. So it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon. Thank you to Vidya and Suneet for inviting me, because I think it's probably going to be just as valuable for me to have a conversation with you. I hope so. It's about to be something that we both take some value from. Let me just say a little bit about my history and my practice, and we can take it from there in terms of the direction of what you'd like to hear about today. The first question that I always have to remember to answer, because I often leave it out and people wonder, is why the yellow shoes? And I wear yellow because in the Hindu system of ashramas and vanaprasthi, in fact, I usually introduce myself at interfaith conferences as an ordained Hindu vanaprasthi, an American Protestant Christian, and when my two Jewish godsons began their Torah studies, I was an enthusiastic Jew dancing around the synagogue with the Torah scrolls. So, as far as I'm concerned, I will take divinity wherever I can find it, and in whatever form it comes. Because divinity is a mother. And when the baby says, "Mommy, put on the blue dress," she puts on the blue dress. And when she wants the red dress, she wears the red dress. So, divinity has a form for every human growth need that exists. And that's my approach to divinity and spirituality. I have found over the course of my life that the very best manual, the very best map for the process of spiritual practice that I've found is the Yoga Sutras of Vedanta. And so that's something that I've studied quite a bit. I met Swami Vedabharati when I was 19 years old. This was a couple of years ago. And I had had a lingering curiosity in my mind for some time as a kid about meditation and about Indian religion. And one day, just after I graduated from high school, a teacher who was an important mentor to me said, "I'm having this Hindu priest come on Thursday to talk about meditation, if I might be interested." Before his monastic life, he was an Arya Samaj priest. He was raised in an Arya Samaj tradition, and took a job as a professor of Sanskrit and South Asian Studies at the University of Minnesota, where I come from. And he gave quite an amazing lecture on meditation that immediately, it was It was not just love at first sight. It was a reacquaintance over a number of lifetimes. I'm sure that some of you have even had the experience of meeting people sometimes that you know, that you recognize, but that you don't know. And I have learned to appreciate some of these when they seem to imply a previous relationship. I began taking meditation classes shortly after that. And within a year or so, I had switched my undergraduate major from theater arts to South Asian languages and literature, and had the great opportunity to study the Swami Veda, the greatest living exponent of the Veda in any country anywhere. The great scholar of yoga and Ayurveda, David Frawley, has always said there are three things you should read on the Veda, and only three. One is Sri Aurobindo's Secret of the Veda, which is a astoundingly beautiful book. The writings of Kavyakunta Ganapati Muni and his disciple of Varma Maharshi, and Swami Vedapati. And so, in my undergraduate education in Sanskrit, I had the privilege of receiving not only the Western scholarly interpretation, but also the inner Brahmanical tradition as well. And I had no idea the value of that gift at the time. I was a total idiot. But fortunately, I was an idiot who was being guided. I sort of dove full on into yoga after that. Lived in an ashram in Minnesota for a year. Became a Hatha yoga teacher in the middle of the 1970s. And then I set about, as many of you are, the whole task in life of establishing a career, sorting out relationships, and all of those sorts of tasks of early adulthood. I was a little more distant from the tradition for a few years in the process of doing that. During that early period, though, there was one really formative experience. In 1974, my Gurudev Swami Varma brought a group of American tourists to, well, they weren't tourists, they were people in our tradition, to the Mahakumbha Mela in Haridwar. And I was a poor, struggling student at the time, and badly wanted to make this trip. But of course I had no money. And one day, shortly before the registrations closed, my mother called me up and said, "Your grandmother has given us some money, and we've decided to give each of you kids $1,000. Now the price of the trip was exactly $1,000. So off my money went, and off I went to India. And it was a very different India in the 70s, let me tell you. In Rishikesh at the time, there were no hotels, no restaurants, nothing. It was all dharmashalas and government guest houses, that's all there was. And so we had a very interesting time. Fortunately, during those years, there were some very great yogis who were still in the body. Ananda Mahima, Devarya Baba, the head of the Raman, the order of sannyasis. Just a really interesting, some very interesting darshan during that trip. I came to Rishikesh and had this overwhelming feeling. This is my home. This river is my mother. Now that was kind of weird for an American kid, but I just told myself, you're studying Sanskrit, you're going to India, of course you're going to feel that. So, fast forward 22 years, 1996. Finished my doctoral studies in psychology. Literally, as I was leaving the house to go to my doctoral commencement for some reason, I got this thing in my mind to call Swami Veda in India. I had not seen him in person for 5 years. He had, since I saw him, become a Swami. I had no idea what to expect. So I told him, I'm coming in a year to visit. And I knew that he was very ill and my guru, Swami Varma, was ill, and I had no idea whether either of them would survive. So I went to the commencement, I came home and I thought, now, sat down and did a little figuring about how much this was going to cost. For about a 6-week trip, it looked like it was about $10,000, and I thought, holy moly, about $10,000. I don't have that kind of money. So I worried about this for a while, for several days. And then a lady came into my office one day that I had been seeing in psychotherapy for quite a while at a very low rate, because she personally was quite poor, but her family was wealthy. And she told me she had received an inheritance, and that she wanted to pay the full fee for all of the sessions that we had had over 3 or 4 years. We sat down and figured it out. Exactly $10,000. She wrote me the check. Off goes the check, and off I go to I arrived in Rishikesh after a harrowing taxi ride from Delhi at 4 times the going rate. And thought we reached the ashram in early evening, and I thought I should just settle down a little bit before I go say hello. Just wanted to, so I'm sitting in the dining hall eating my dinner and discussing with some friends. And all of a sudden, here are his hands on my shoulders. He came down to greet me. I came to Rishikesh in 1972 with this feeling that this place was my home. 22 years later, the feeling is 5 times stronger. Even though I haven't touched my Sanskrit in 20 years. So I was initiated into simple practice. And with that initiation came the knowledge of my relationship with this lineage beyond the life of this body. And once that love touches your heart, there's no turning back from it. Not possible. I had heard so many times my mentor, Swami Veda, tell the story of meeting his guru. He had been a very famous child preacher in India. You can find newspaper stories about him all over the country in the 1950s and 60s. In fact, I think he gave his first public lecture here in Delhi in 1947 at the age of 9. At the age of 13, he picked a fight with one of the Shankaracharyas over a philosophical issue and won. Really unbelievable mind. When he was 19, I went to the Kumbh Mela in Allahabad, and he had felt guidance in his heart for years. He assumed that he was being guided by some guru in the Himalayas, but he had no idea who it might be. And so he went to the Kumbh Mela and asked everybody who was the best guru. And everybody said the same thing. You have to meet the Swami Rama from the Himalayas. He's just come out of the mountains. So he began to seek Swami Rama. And everywhere he would go, it was, oh, he just left. He's coming in a week. Sorry you missed him. Every single time. So finally, after many years of chasing him, he just completely gave up. He was sent by the Arya Samaj to serve Hindu community in Guyana in South America, where he established quite a famous school, and began to teach, and was really in kind of a state of despair about his ambitions for liberation. So he decided finally that he would get married and raise a family and become a Sanskrit guess that's what this life would be. So he went to Europe. First year he got a BA from the University of London. Second year an MA. Third year he is D.Lit from the University of Utrecht. So he gets a D.Lit from Utrecht without ever having attended one day of class anywhere in his life. Completely self-educated person. So he gets hired for this position as a Sanskrit professor in Minnesota, of all places. Very cold compared to Guyana. And somehow our paths cross. In 1969, a student in the department came to him and said, "Say, there's this Swami at a hotel downtown giving some lectures, maybe we should go." And Swami Veda, realistically, knew more than most Swamis. So he wasn't very interested in meeting Swamis. So he was kind of, I don't know. Then his wife got after him. And Manji is a force to be reckoned with. And so she came and she said, "Look, it's Deepavali. And this person is away from home. Let's take some food and help them feel at home." So to this, he could not say no. So he was going to test this one. And he has a gift for being able to compose in Sanskrit of any period at any level of difficulty. So he chose a particular style and composed a very difficult shloka of greeting. So he meets the Swami, he gives the shloka, the Swami comes back with a shloka from exactly the same style, at exactly the same level of difficulty off the top of his head. So he thought, maybe this guy knows something. So they talk, and he's invited back to his hotel room every night for the next 3 weeks. Now, somehow in this whole process, names are never exchanged. And only after 3 weeks did he realize that this was the very Swami Varma that he had been chasing all over India. And when that light went off in his mind, he asked Baba, "Why did you take so long?" And Baba just said, "With your karma." So even someone as great as Swami Veda has some karma to deal with. And the gurus wait until the right moment, until they can be useful to you. I heard that story a million times. It's a beautiful story. I did not realize until I had that deeper initiation in our tradition that Swami Rama also came from the caves of the Himalayas to find me. And that was it. That's the moment where I ceased to be a student and became a disciple, even though they called me disciple from day one. When that kind of love touches your heart, as I say, there's no turning back from it. And so I began teaching more actively with the tradition. And that just gradually grew and grew and grew. I remember one time in 1998, at a seminar in Rishikesh, I was helping Swamiji with some of the lectures, writing things in Devanagari on the board. And he took me aside under his arm and asked for everybody's attention and said, embarrassingly, he said, "You will not believe what's going to come from this person in the next 10 years. And I looked at him like, "What? Me? Are you out of your mind?" But things developed nicely. And I had the privilege at this point of really having a family all over the world, in so many countries. And thank God I no longer have to consider myself an American, given the way our politics is degenerating at the moment. So that's a little bit on the spiritual side. In 2007, I took initiation as a Vanaprasthi from Swami Veda and Shankaracharya of Kargir, Egypt. And since that time, I've really been serving the mission mostly, probably 60% of my time. As a psychologist, now I was guided in my baccalaureate education by Swami Veda. I then took a master's in psychology. I guess I'll back up a little bit from that. In my undergraduate years, I avoided anything about science. My science courses in my BA degree were food science, you can see I learned well, and astronomy. So then I decided I wanted to be a doctor. So that wasn't going to do it. So I had to go back and take 2 years of math and chemistry and physics and biology and genetics and all that stuff. And discovered I actually quite liked science. And I appreciated the methodology of it really well. So then I entered a master's program in psychology. My first course in theories of personality, I was absolutely shocked that it isn't really science. None of these theories have any experimental basis at all. None of them. They're all theories of psychotherapy and theories of personality are mostly stories people tell about what worked. That's about it. And so that gives us many different approaches to working with people, which is a good thing, but not a particularly scientific thing. So I finished my master's degree and began working as a psychotherapist. I really enjoyed that work. I still do. Even though I decided finally I think I'm going to retire at the end of January next year. I decided that I would like to get a doctoral degree, but I was going to wait until I was completely bored with working at the master's level. So that took 4 or 5 years, and I had some goals about learning certain things in between my master's and my doctorate. So I entered a doctoral degree at the same school. Actually, I've been begging them to create a doctoral program for years, and they just had all kinds of excuses and not going to do it. So in 1990, all of a sudden my old advisor calls me up and says, "Hey, we're going to do a doctoral program. You want to be in it?" So I said, "Okay." And so I was part of the first group that came through that program. And my doctoral advisor was a crazy guy. His name, very famous family therapist, his name is Bradford Keeney. Founded a school of family therapy called Cybernetic Epistemology. I'd like to know the words. Brad was another genius. His high school science project for a science fair was to build a machine to keep transplant organs alive before they could be transplanted. He started his college at MIT. In the first week, he tested out of all the mathematics in one stroke, which at MIT is tough to do, I can tell you. So another brilliant guy. When Brad was 19, everything seems to happen when you're 19 years old. I don't know, I think some of you can probably testify to this. When Brad was 19, he was walking across his college campus one day, and he realized as he walked, his feet were not touching the ground. His feet were 2 inches off the ground. They levitated. He was completely freaked out, as you might imagine. He ran for the nearest building, which was the college chapel, sat down, and immediately went into a state of samadhi that lasted for 8 or 9 hours. He sat there frozen with this procession of beings from the superconscious presenting themselves to him. Well, it scared him, as you might imagine, and he ran from this for years. Gradually, his spirituality began to catch up with him. He began to have strange dreams. And the next day, he would always encounter something that was in his dream. And he learned to follow these clues. And in the process of doing that, he met first most of the important indigenous medicine people of the Native American tribes in North America and Central America. Then his dreams became stranger. One day, he had a dream where he was told he would meet a bushman. He thought, how am I going to meet a bushman? A week later, a letter arrives from Cape Town, South Africa, inviting him to give a series of lectures. His host is a white psychologist who had been trained by the great African spiritual leader Credo Mutwa to be a shaman, a sangoma in the Zulu tradition. And so the professor introduced Brad to Credo Mutwa, and they were trading stories about their life, and he mentioned his dream about meeting a bushman. So Mutwa began to laugh, and Brad said, well, what's so funny? And Mutwa said, did you know my mother was a bushman? So he sent Brad to his mother's people in Botswana. He drives up in the Land Rover. All the people are jumping up and down saying, oh, you're back, you lived with us in the 19th century after the American Civil War, and then you died and went away, and now you return. So the healers in that tradition took him under their wing and taught him their traditional healing methodology, which is a kind of Kundalini phenomenon that is stimulated by a sort of dance that they do around a fire. Then he happened to cross paths with a woman in Japan named Ikeko Suneet, who is the energy healer to the national treasures of Japan. Little lady, about 1.5 meters tall. She weighs about 30 kilos. She does a kind of energy work with people where a lot of healers can move energy in a person. She actually injects chi or prana into people with enormous force. Brad is about 2 meters tall, 110 kilos. Mrs. Osumi holds up her hands like this and blows him off his feet against the back wall of the house with this energy. So he was impressed. And she also took him under her wing and taught him her traditional pre-Buddhist energy work. So it's interesting that Brad in his spirituality never really made contact with the sort of major civilized religious traditions. His connections were all indigenous, all tribal people in many, many different cultures. North America, Central America, Japan, Africa, all over the place. And he began to facilitate this awareness. All of these shamans have begun to become aware of each other, even though they've never left their own country. Very interesting phenomenon. So here, I find myself in a graduate program with another spiritually just astounding person. I couldn't believe my good fortune. He was the most provocative teacher I have ever had. The first hour of a class would be such a thorough deconstruction of the subject that everyone in the room was sick to their stomach and wanted to throw up at the end of the lecture. He was very good at this. And the whole rest of the semester, you had to rebuild that subject for yourself. It's a very hard way to learn, but it's very efficient. And for me, it was very effective. A lot of my fellow students hated it, but I thought he was the best teacher I ever had. And so he wrote a brilliant book that I was telling Divya about the other day, deconstructing the scientific methodology and investigating human behavior using a cybernetic philosophy of a fellow named Hans von Forster. Some of you might be interested in this book. It makes a good argument for using the principles of aesthetics as a basis for therapy rather than Aristotelian science. The title is The Aesthetics of Change. The author is Bradford Keeney, K-E-E-N-E-Y. And it was published in 1983 by Guilford Press. It's not a very long book. It is kind of dense. I think you'll appreciate it if you read it. It's one of a number of critiques of scientific methodology in Western psychology that I think have been very, very important to have over the last 30 years. For some reason, in the realm of physics, which is sort of the template for the rest of science, there was a huge change in how people looked at the nature of the world in the early 20th century. Up to that time, everything was dominated by the science that was based on the mathematics of Newton. So it's Newtonian mechanics is the name for it. This is the lawful sort of physics that we all struggle through in high school and college. And the ideas of physics and the kinds of experimental ideas that come out of physics have dominated the field of psychology really right up until the present moment. Physicists went further a century ago into the field of quantum mechanics. And they began to break down some of those ideas. I have a friend who's a science educator, and he wrote a brilliant article recently called "In Praise of Lawless Physics." Yeah, advocating being very cautious about teaching laws in physics because all of those laws operate only within a certain range of phenomena. And if you go outside that range very far in either direction, you completely break down. So these quantum ideas are quite different from the way we think about the material world in a Newtonian way. And I think they're more appropriate to the kinds of things that we need to look at in both scientific research and also in understanding people's problems. One small example is the notion of quantum locality. The idea that if one thing causes something to happen in another thing, they have to be near each other. This turns out not to be true at all. Not at all. And there have been a number of demonstrations of this principle. But here's a really interesting one. There's an investigator in California at the Institute for Noetic Sciences named Dr. Dean Radin, R-A-D-I-N. He produced a really interesting book in 2013 called Supernormal. Now, Radin has always been interested in yoga and in the human capabilities represented by the vibhutis that Patanjali discusses in the 3rd chapter of the Yoga Sutras. Usually these are referred to as siddhis, but Patanjali does not choose his terms artistically. Where he uses a different word, he means something different always. He also doesn't repeat himself, ever. In sutra literature and Sanskrit, that does not happen. The motto of the grammarians was, elimination of half an unnecessary syllable is worthy of a life's work. That's how scrupulous they were about this. So Patanjali chooses his words carefully, and he uses the word vibhuti from bhu, meaning become. And so vibhuti is a natural development of becoming. It's not something that's added on to you, which is the meaning of the siddhi. So these capabilities that are described in chapter 3 of the Yoga Sutras exist in all of you, measurably. I'll talk some more about that in a minute, but one of the other experiments in this book was a proof of quantum non-locality. It was a famous physics experiment investigating whether light is particles or waves. It happened in the early 20th century, developed by a fellow named Wolfgang Pauli. And Radin, the experiment passes a light beam through a very thin slit. And then on the screen in the back, if the light goes through the slit as particles, it creates a pattern on the screen called the diffraction pattern. If it goes through as waves, it creates what's called an interference pattern. It turns out that how you observe the experiment determines which result you get. This sort of began to do away with the idea of objectivity in science. There is no such thing. Objectivity is a fiction, total fiction. So he put Polly's experiment in a black box, and hooked it up to a computer, and had the computer just run the experiment at totally random times. When there were no people around, you get the particle-based diffraction pattern. Then he invited some people to come into the lab. He didn't tell them what was in the box. He just said, think about what's in the box. So they did. While they were thinking about the experiment, it changed. And we got the interference pattern from photons as waves. So that was a nice demonstration of that original experiment. Then he did the same experiment with the black box in California and a group of people in India, and said to the people in India, okay, at such and such a time, precisely, think about what's in the black box in my office. Same result. An elegant proof of quantum non-locality using totally conventional scientific methodology. Just beautiful. Just a beautiful experiment. He also, in this book, does a meta-analysis of all of the research that anyone has ever done on supernormal abilities. These are called in the research literature psi phenomena, PSI. So, because he was doing a meta-analysis, for those of you that have a little bit of statistical background, his number of subjects was so huge that the probability tests that he did on the very small effect sizes that he found were absolutely non-random. So he was effectively able to prove, again, using totally conventional scientific methodology, every human being has these abilities to some measurable extent. He was also able to show that with greater experience in meditation, those phenomena increase. And this was potentially his point. These abilities exist in every person. And they're cultivated through the practice of meditation. And at some point in your growth, in your spiritual growth, these things come as natural developments. It's not something that you seek. The Yoga Sutras are very careful about warning you not to do that. Because of course, if you do that, the ego gets hold of those things and it becomes a huge distraction in your progress in samadhi. So this is one example of some really, really wonderful research that begins to sort of open up the scientific part of psychology to a new way of looking at it, using totally conventional methods. So I highly recommend this book also. It's titled Supernormal, and the author is Dean Radin, R-A-D-I-N. He did some experiments with Swami Veda. Swami Veda was trying to replicate a demonstration that his guru did, our guru did, in 1970 at the Manager Foundation, where they hooked him up to an electroencephalogram, and he demonstrated the state of Yoga Nidra. In other words, the ability to consciously enter deep, dreamless, delta wave sleep, and yet remain aware inside and also remain aware of your surroundings. This is one of the practices that is a preparation for the practice of samadhi in our tradition. We used to say the boundary between deep sleep and samadhi is very thin. The practice of Yoga Nidra gradually helps you to wear that boundary away. So Radin hooked Swamiji up to the electroencephalogram, and they were sitting there talking with each other before the experiment. Radin realized he had left the machine running. So they're having a conversation. Swamiji has his eyes open, but he's making delta waves on the EEG, even with his eyes open. Now, a neurologist would tell you this is not possible. But it happened. And that's how, in part, we discovered that Swami Veda actually never left a state of yoga nidra, waking or sleeping. He was always in yoga nidra. We ended up measuring this several times. Really unbelievable. In 1970, Swami Varma had also come to the West with a mission of trying to demonstrate scientifically some of the things that the yogis had always said. Now, the instrumentation back then was kind of crude. So he did the EEG experiment. He did an experiment in telekinesis where they mounted some knitting needles on a post and very carefully insulated everything for electromagnetic fields, air currents, temperature changes, all kinds of things. And he made the needles move by thinking about them, by using his concentration. That was documented. In Germany, he did a slightly stranger experiment. He showed the group of doctors his arm, and as he was speaking, 2 cysts appeared on his arm. And he said, "This one is malignant, this one is not. Take the biopsies and tell me the result." So they took biopsies, and then he made the cysts disappear. And the results were as he predicted. One was malignant and one was not. This experiment was never published. Why? Because, the scientists said, who were supposed to be empirical beings, we can't believe our eyes. This couldn't be, right? He ran into this over and over again. And finally he just gave up. Because science had become a kind of religion, as it is in the West. In a way, science and religion have kind of traded places. And the limitations of the kind of science that people are thinking about now holds back their ability to learn what they need to learn about stuff. An even weirder demonstration happened when a psychiatrist came to interview Swami Rama in his hotel one time. He brought a recorder with him. And as he was unpacking his recorder, he realized he had forgotten to pack the microphone. So Swamiji asked, "Oh, what does it look like?" He described the mic. He said, "Where did you leave it in your house?" So he described where he had left it. He said, "No, tell me in the room precisely where you left it." So he did. So Swamiji puts his hand behind his back and said, "Is this the microphone?" You know what the psychiatrist did? He packed up his bag, put on his coat, and left. So you have to believe your eyes. Even when your eyes are telling you something you think shouldn't be. And that's the nature of being an empiricist. And one of the problems of particularly Newtonian Western science is that our empiricism, our ability to learn from our experience, is limited to data from the senses. And that data can only take you so far. And it cannot take you into the depths of the mind. Because the sensory mind, as we know from psychology of yoga, is a very superficial part of the mind field. Very superficial. Now, there are some inroads beginning to happen in that way also. Back about 4 years ago, I realized that I had not refreshed my knowledge of neuroscience since I was originally trained in the 1980s. And so I figured I had better read up. So I bought a book by a psychiatrist from California named Daniel Siegel called Mind Sight. Very articulate little book. I'm very grateful to him because I went up with son of mine to a retreat place in the mountains in Kumon called Takeshwar. And usually when I'm in Takeshwar, I sit and do sadhana. This time we had, in the fall, a monsoon-style rain. I mean, it was unbelievable how much rain. For 3 days, we couldn't leave the room. So I sat and read a book. And I was just amazed because neuroscience has become an entirely different discipline like 3 times since I was trained. I used to think neurons didn't renew themselves, that you inherited a mature nervous system at the age of 18 to 20, and from then on it was simply a story of loss and accommodation until you're dead. People say economics is the dismal profession, the dismal science. I actually think neurology is the dismal science, because most of the time all a neurologist can do is tell you how bad it's going to be. So he described this brilliant observer of birds, of all things, ornithologist, who was watching some old parakeets that he owned. And he realized all of a sudden these parakeets, even though they're near death, are learning new songs. And he wondered, could they possibly be growing new neurons? So he happened to know how to label new neurons by feeding the birds a chemically labeled form of glucose. So he fed this to the birds, and when they died, he sectioned their brains and examined them, and sure enough, new neurons all over the place. So he thought, this has to be the same for human beings. So he found a group of elder human beings who were willing to consent to a similar experiment. So they took the labeled glucose for some time, and when they left their bodies, he took a sample of their brain tissue and sectioned it, and sure enough, new neurons all over the place. So this really was a revolution in neuroscience. Especially hopeful for people who have very biologically based problems, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorders. You can get a new brain, or at least part of a new brain. Obviously there's an equilibrium between the creation of new neurons and the old ones that are dying out, but the thing that's very interesting about this is that the part of your brain that organizes all of those new neurons into neural nets is this section of the brain in your forehead, right behind the center of your forehead. The last part of the brain to evolve, the most human part of our central nervous system. No other animal has something like the human prefrontal cortex. It's the part that gives us our ability to choose our behavior rather than simply respond to instinctive drives. It's the part of us that enables us to experience joy, which for many reasons I will just assert for the moment is not an emotion. It's very different from an emotion. It's what we feel when we grow. When your 2-year-old baby spends all of these tens of thousands of experiments learning to walk. Tries and tries and tries, and falls on his or her behind over and over again, bursting into tears. And then one day, balances on both feet, and one foot comes forward, and the second foot comes forward, and what's the next thing? Sorry. That's the parents. It's like that for everything we do when we grow, whether it's physical development, or the development of our emotions, or spiritual development. You can think, for example, of Ananda or Brahman as the perfection of that process of neural integration. At a biological level, that's how you might explain it. there's a correspondence here, a correlation between the highest spiritual realization and what goes on in the organization of your nervous system. The neurologists say neurons that fire together, wire together. And that wiring happens here. This part integrates the entire brain and central nervous system in every way. Vertically, in terms of the evolutionary layers of your nervous system, the reptile brain in your spinal cord and pons and cerebellum, the early mammalian brain in your limbic system, the later mammalian brain in the cerebral cortex, and then the human brain in the frontal cortex. So there's that vertical integration, then there's horizontal integration in terms of the collaboration of the two hemispheres with each other. And you have many different domains of integration that happen that involve things like identity or sense of time. Siegel details things in the book. It's really interesting reading. So this is one of the ways that contemporary neuroscience has begun to follow what yoga and what Indian psychology has been teaching for centuries. And I've just been working on a book on the principle of emotional purification in yoga. That's sort of part of the purpose of the book is Patanjali meets neuroscience. And one of the arguments that I make in the book is that given the fact that the stuff yoga has to teach tests out so beautifully in the research that's been done in the past decade, it is time for the yogis to begin to lead the research, because they can take us into the intangible parts of the mind field and help us to find ways to investigate and to demonstrate these to people. And out of that, to develop ways to help people. Now, I'm very cautious here about the idea of using yoga for therapy. Yoga is not for therapy. Yoga is for enlightenment. Therapy is a side effect, a really good side effect. If you pursue yoga for the sake of enlightenment, therapy will happen. In fact, we should have a t-shirt that says, therapy happens. And I've been a member of the International Association of Yoga Therapists for 15 years, and I don't believe in it. And that's part of why I'm a member of the organization. I'm trying to keep them from being taken over by physical therapists, which is part of what's going on. But I also don't want yoga to lose its soul any more than it already has, especially in my country. You have all of these power yoga, and you can even get a certificate in butt yoga. You can believe that. Yeah, it's crazy, just crazy. So it's really interesting.
What I observed is a lot of students were leaving, much like the psychiatrists and other people that you mentioned.
Well, who knows if that's the case, but so I like very much that you're pursuing study in Indian psychology, because I think that will help you stay with the authentic sources of this gift to humanity that involves in many ways the development of what is best in us as human beings, which is our compassion. And there's a whole other neurological story about how that happens in your central nervous system that's very well explained in this book. You really understand the neurobiology of compassion in a way that's just really, really exciting. And it gives you a new way to think, for example, about the yamas and niyamas in the yoga system. These are refinements in your ability to be compassionate with other beings, because the other side of nonviolence, nonviolence is sort of the negative way of explaining compassion. So there's a lot of exciting stuff happening, and I want to hopefully be a source of inspiration and hope to you all about your ability to make significant changes in the way that psychology gets practiced. I think, given Indian culture, you have to find a way other than the medical model to do it. And obviously this is one of the problems and the boundaries between disciplines here. But, as I was explaining to Divya yesterday, become a translator. Now, I have done yoga with every single therapy client I have seen since 1984. I teach them diaphragmatic breathing. I teach them relaxation exercises. I teach them mindfulness practices. I teach most of them Nadi Shodhana, the alternate nostril breathing exercise. And I even do postures with some people, particularly people with chronic pain. I don't call it yoga, I call it psychotherapy, because that's what it is. And I sneak the yoga in there, you know? If somebody's going to be put off by the word yoga, I'll use neurospeak, or I'll use psychospeak, right? These are all languages that you can use. And that sounds like an effort to just kind of get around the disciplinary boundaries that exist. And to some extent that's true. But I also think there's so much more potential for collaboration, for understanding science in a different way, for you to actually change the way that science gets done, especially where it applies to human beings. And that's really important work. It's tough to figure out how to make that work in practical terms. You know, some of you may decide to go on and become clinicians within a medical model system that begin to function in this alternative way. That's what happened in the West. Part of the reason neuroscience is changing now is that the old hippie meditators like me all got doctorate degrees and they're running a research establishment now. Seriously. All of these people investigating neuroplasticity are old meditators, most of them from the TM tradition. Richard Davidson, TM. John Kabat-Zinn is from the Zen tradition. Who else is? A whole bunch of TM people. Siegel, I think, is a Buddhist Vipassana practitioner. So there's a lot of possibility here for really good things to happen. And I'm so happy that you have the opportunity to study in that vein and to begin to think in that way. Because to a certain extent you are scientists, but whenever you undertake healing, whenever you seek to heal human beings, this is the goal of yoga. The goal of Sankhya is the relief of suffering. Exactly the same way as the Buddhist tradition. Whenever you become a healer, you are first an artist, second a scientist. The best physicians are always artists. They always improvise. They always look for what works. And then they find a way to explain it, usually later. It's okay. You don't have to explain it beforehand. So think of it that way. I mean, we use this term healing arts as a sort of a throwaway term a lot. But it's important that people take it seriously. Because the other thing about healing that is rapidly being lost in Western medicine is that all healing happens in relationship. And one of the problems in the medical profession in my country is that people have gotten so greedy, have tried to make so much money. And it's happening in India too, that they have less and less time to spend with people. In order to make the right level of income, a doctor has to turn over his patient every 5 to 10 minutes. They don't have time to sit and talk to people. So doctors hardly have relationships with people anymore. I did a lot of psychotherapeutic work in the early days of the AIDS epidemic, when there were no medicines. The only thing we had to work with people's relationship. And it was just pitiful to see what would happen with some of the doctors sometimes. Oh. But the really good ones, the ones who were really practicing and developing their sense of compassion, they were able to improvise. They were able to see the humane side of anything that happened. There's a clinical story about that. I had a client named Richard, who was one of my greatest teachers ever. The sickest person I ever saw with HIV. Just, he had probably been ill for 20 years where I met him in the late 80s. He came into my office on a day when he was suicidal. And over a couple of weeks, we were able to help with his depression. We'll just do some kind of ordinary garden variety counseling and therapy about dealing with emotions and dealing with your family. Got him on the first medications that came out to stabilize his physical health. Got him on some medication to stabilize his mental health. And for a couple of years, he was actually in pretty good shape. He actually did a lot of teaching and training for health professionals about HIV because he was a nurse by profession. Richard had a particularly bad episode of pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, which is a kind of pneumonia that's caused by a very rare organism. He went into a hospital and antibiotics don't work against this organism. They have to use cancer chemotherapy, which are very toxic and often have very severe side effects. And they made him horribly nauseated. Just horribly nauseated. He recovered. He seemed to recover, which was just amazing. He came out of the hospital, but the nausea stayed with him, and there was no medical reason for it to be there. Cancer chemotherapy had long since been discontinued. In the hospital, when this happened, he was losing weight very quickly, which is a big morbidity factor in people with AIDS. At least it used to be before we had medications that we have now. People lost so much weight and they would rapidly begin to die. And so his doctor was getting very alarmed about this. So the doctor just made a typical sort of medical decision. They would put a feeding tube in him to make sure that he gets some nutrition, right? Kind of a logical thing, sort of, until you realize you're putting a feeding tube into somebody who has no immune system. What's that called? That's called a freeway for pathogens. It's the stupidest decision I had seen in a long time. And I argued with this doctor, don't do it. I can fix this with hypnosis. Don't do that. But he was going to do it, so he did. And he put the feeding tube in. Thank God there was no infection. Richard was released from the hospital, still had his nausea. His first session, after he got out, he came in. We did some hypnosis to look into, and hypnosis, to put this in the context of yoga, is a specialized case of yoga nidra. I'm setting out to demonstrate and prove this at our lab in Rishikesh. So we did some hypnosis to help him identify where his nausea came from. It was because he was sick to death of living and dying by other people's schedules, other people's desires. You know, it's like in the midst of all of this medical care, as the patient, he was getting lost as a person. It was an expression of his rage about this being so invaded. Once he understood that, came out of the hypnosis, he was fine. No nausea. In fact, he told me the next week, he went home after having had no solid food for 3 months. He had a pizza. Any of you ever worked with someone who hadn't had solid food for 3 months? You know, you advance the diet very gradually, right? You go right to pizza in one jump. The doctor completely lost his sense of relationship to his patient. Because if he had been thinking about that, if he had been thinking about the whole person, it would have occurred to him the risks that he was taking by putting this feeding tube in. So there were lots of situations like that in those days where there was a lot of iatrogenic, doctor-caused injury to people as a result of doctors throwing technology at their own fears. This was a huge problem at that time. Thankfully, they've calmed down a little bit now, and we have much better treatment. Now somebody comes in to talk to me in therapy who has AIDS, and they'll mention an intake interview, and it will never come up again in the rest of their therapy, because the treatment is much, much better. So these are some just improvisational ideas about how science can change and how you can become artists in the art of healing with compassion. Because one of the things we really know from the long-term experience of psychotherapy is that that's basically what happens in therapy. People get healed by compassion. Compassion is healing per se. And it's the greatest gift we have to give anybody. So I think at this point it would probably be good to see what questions or comments are. I actually have no notion of the time in our chat.
Interestingly, without being a therapist, I share that in my first class in counseling. For me, in my understanding, compassion is the most important. That is what brings about healing. Students know it. I picked it up intuitively, and Stoma which is ordained in, also picked it up intuitively, and I suppose seen it in his long experience with psychotherapy.
It's always a wonder to see this happen. It's always miraculous. You know, everybody looks a little tired. How about if we take 5 minutes and you just move around a little bit? And we'll sit down again and I'll take some questions, okay? Good.
So I actually had a small comment that I'd like to make.
I wanted your views on this. You had mentioned that the Indian system has a lot to offer. You know, the yoga method is very powerful. The traditional systems that exist in India are very powerful. The small observation, and they counter a lot of the negatives that science has brought into the field of psychology and psychotherapy and so on. The point that I wanted to mention very quickly was that it is absolutely true that the Indian system is incredibly powerful, but what must be understood and accepted is that it has got slightly corrupted right now. We have the most powerful system which has been abused for an incredibly long period of time, which is why the greatest exponent of astrology is Acharya Vamdev, David Froehlich. He is now the person who's respected and accepted as an astrologer. Swami Ram set up his organization in the US. Deepak Chopra has followed the transcendental meditation system in the US. A lot of what is coming out of India, unfortunately, is stuff which is a distortion of the original. And until we are able to fix that, we will still forever look to the West for guidance of our own system and our own methods because we have abused it. You have people like Vikram Chaudhary who have, he's from another planet altogether. But the funny thing is that he's the disciple. Vikram Chaudhary is the disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda's brother, And Paramahansa Yogananda is a great saint, has a great system, is a great teacher. His brother Vishnu Chaudhary was also a highly spiritually involved person. But look what Vikram Chaudhary has done using what he learned over there. So we have this ability and this tendency to distort and corrupt everything, which is why people don't take us seriously anymore. If you go to Europe, Rome is littered with people, Indians, Pakistanis and Bangladeshis who are pretending to be levitating in front of the Colosseum, hiding a steel plate which is embedded in the ground. They're pretending to be great yogis, and the West can see through such things, which is why they don't respect a lot of our traditional systems until it is validated and empirically proven and has passed through the academic model of the West.
Yes, let's take our 5 minutes to move around a little bit and we'll return to